This is Wade's World, where we talk to the most interesting people in the world on KABF 88.3, the voice of the people.
You want to see how the other half lives? You want to see how we get around? Why don't you come visit me on the east side of town?
This is Wade Rathke, and you are listening to Wade's World, a Voice of the People program. Welcome to the east side of town so that we can talk about how the other half lives and what life is like here living in Wade's World, whether that's the east side of Little Rock or New Orleans or on Acorn Radio in Nairobi, Arua, Kampala, Bengaluru, Bristol, or Bombay, points east and west, where we are either rebroadcast or live streamed at www.kbf.org, wamf.org, or acornradio.org. A podcast will be available of this show and on these websites and at www.chieforganizer.org. You know the story on Wade's World. We talk to the most interesting people in the world. Today, we're talking to Louis Bourgeois, who is the executive director of the Mississippi Prison Rights Initiative, which is a nonprofit in Mississippi. And he's worked with people in Parchman Prison to put out a very interesting new book that we're going to hear all about, Unit 29. Welcome to Wade's World, Louis.
Thank you, Wade, for letting us talk today.
Well, my pleasure. And I first have to disclose kind of why this is not our usual show. It's not the usual thing we look at, but I actually have been to Parchman Prison. My mother and my grandparents and my mother and two uncles are all deceased now, but they lived in Drew, Mississippi. And my great aunt was the postmistress in Drew, and part of her responsibilities were delivering mail to Parchman Prison. So as a boy, many years ago, we're talking 65, 70 years ago, my brother and I several times drove with her, it was actually more frightening to drive with my Aunt Sue than it was to go into Parchman Prison for us, because she had one of those old three-hole Buicks that she rode 2 tires on the pavement and 2 tires on the shoulder the whole way. Luckily, it's not a long trip from Drew to Parchman. So by the time you got to Parchman, you were just so glad to be in the prison and safe. But those were many years ago, and Parchman has a historic reputation, none of which is very good, is it, Louis?
No, I'm not a scholar on Parchman itself, but I've spent some time there and teaching writing. So,
well, you must know that, everybody from Lead Belly to civil rights protesters were held in Parchman. It's always been it's always had sort of a brutal reputation, which makes your book more interesting. You don't have to be a historian to know it's a tough place. Nobody wants to go to Parchman Prison.
Particularly 29 can be pretty rough. I can attest to that.
Describe Unit 29 so that the listeners have more an idea of what that is.
So 29 is the largest unit in Mississippi State Penitentiary, Parchman Farm. I think there's a total of 42 units, but only a handful of those are being used. But in any case, 29 is the largest unit, and it's also the unit where people on Mississippi's death row are housed. It's also a truly sort of maximum security unit in which you do have some zones, which are the buildings where the inmates are kept. There are some zones that are open pod, which people can walk around freely. But there's also about a third of 29 that's essentially solitary confinement. So these particular individuals are isolated from everyone else. And that's where the majority of this book takes place, where the writing came from.
I saw something where you mentioned there are almost 700 people in Unit 29. So a third of that would be, 250 or so people in solitary confinement, or 200 plus for sure. That's difficult.
There's something of that. Yeah, I don't know the exact numbers, but
Well, but we're just giving people a ballpark. This is not, nobody would say this is a walk in the park.
no, that's quite true.
And how did you get involved in this? Because this was not your first step. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, originally, so we started working in the prisons about 10 years ago, and we started in Parchman's Unit 30, which is sort of a medium security type unit, um, a little more laid back than 29, I would say. Just because no one at that point, I mean, now there's a few organizations involved in prison education in Mississippi. But at that point, no one had really thought to do this to sort of call writing from Parchman. And so we were a small press at the time, and we wanted to do that. And so we started in Unit 30. And then from there, the program kind of grew. And then finally, it's interesting that we were invited to 29 by the administration itself. Excuse me. Because this was by the time we got to 29, that was when those riots and so forth were breaking out.
right.
Um, and so the administration, I guess, saw our classes as a way to relieve maybe some of the stress in Unit 29. And so I began teaching there by myself. And at the time, there was some kind of security issue where we couldn't have an actual classroom. So for essentially a year and a half, upward to 2 years, I mean, I taught the classes in the zone, um, in in what they call segregation, and called this writing from we have upward to 30 individuals that we were working with back there. Now, eventually, they did allow us to have a class about the last 6 months of this particular project, in which we met in the gymnasium in 29. But I mean, it was very difficult to try to teach, right?
I imagine, yeah.
In the zone, because I mean, it's very loud. It's very loud. People have to shout because then they're isolated in their cells, so they have no other way of communicating between each other. And so they're shouting. There's also televisions that are blaring constantly. Televisions came to 29 not that long ago, but they installed the televisions, not for to entertain the inmates so much, but I think they use it as a kind of control mechanism, right? So people are not doing what they want, they'll just cut the television off, and then you can control behavior that way. But anyhow, you have these televisions blaring.
And are those in common areas or in their rooms?
Yeah, so like so the unit of these segregated zones are two-tier sort of octagonal shaped buildings, and so the televisions are bolted onto this large pillar in the center of the zone. So even though the inmates themselves are in their cells locked down, they can still see the television. I believe there were three of them, to where most of the people could see the television from there.
Got a wide screen. Now,
Yeah.
were you teaching literature or writing before you started doing this in the prison, or how did this?
Yeah, so I taught at the University of Mississippi for a number of years,
Okay.
And then we started this nonprofit literary arts organization. I kind of took over that full time, and that is now my full-time job. And so yeah, so the classes at least originally, kind of modeled college creative writing workshops and whatnot. But this project in 29, it was something quite different. Because number one, I mean, I had to teach each person individually from cell to cell. So it wasn't like a classroom setup. I tried to adhere to the structure of a normal creative writing workshop, but it was ever difficult. And then I realized, well, what is the point? What am I doing here exactly? So I realized that what I wanted to do was to essentially transcribe this this sort of experience of total oppression into the written word, but done so without any literary pretense. So even though I did each week assign reading assignments, I tried to stay away from highly ornate type of writing because I eventually I said no, I want to get the rawest written message that I can. And the thing is like um, with the exception of one or two people, this actually appeals to me. None of these people had ever attempted to write uh, at all, much less anything, even remotely literary. And I actually found that to be exciting because it was like you were kind of working with totally, uh, untainted potential talent. And somehow I
You
think
weren't having to deal with plagiarism. Let's say that.
yeah, and it's like, yeah, no one trying to
This
be
wasn't AI. You didn't have to worry about Chat
no, you don't have that.
GPT writing the assignment or anything. This was
Anyone,
all raw.
yeah, you don't have anyone trying to be whatever, Raymond Carver or whoever,
Right,
like
exactly.
there's no
Exactly.
imitation, right? So like, I mean, on one hand, that's challenging because it's like, you run the risk of something becoming monotonous, perhaps. But I mean, and also, we got a lot of writing over the course of 2 years back there to choose from, so we were able to sculpt this down to I think a pretty authentic and essential message from this situation at Unit 29, which yeah, it does have and of late, a fairly nasty reputation, which I suppose it should.
Yeah.
Um,
We're talking to Louis Bourgeois, who is the executive director of the Mississippi Prison Rights Initiative, about the new book that he worked with prisoners at Parchman Prison. The book's name is Unit 29, Writing from Parchman Prison. Now, you mentioned you called it down. How many people at different times were involved in this project before you got to the number that you put in the book?
yeah, I mean, it was sort of crazy because for some reason in that particular unit, people are being transferred with some frequency. So some weeks you show up and someone you've been working with for 2 or 3 months in a row would just be gone. They were transferred somewhere else, or in quite a few cases, they were deceased. And I don't really want to conjecture too much about that. There could be legal issues if I talk too much about all that. But yeah, it was totally chaotic in terms of what each week was different, right? So in the collection as it now stands, there are 30, 32 different individual writers, but we probably went through 50 people over the course of almost 3 years that we worked with, and they would just sort of disappear and whatever. And so, yeah, it was a chaotic mess, and but I tried to feed into that, like I mean, these types of prison writing books are now become sort of old hat, and everyone is doing it now. Because I needed to like, I wanted to have a direct experience as much as possible with them and to represent it in this collection. And I think we have. I think, I think it's sort of we somehow pulled it off. A lot of this was not too much conscious effort. It was kind of like just riding it and seeing where it would go. And
And these are some pretty raw pieces. I'm
yeah,
not
some
saying
of
they
them
weren't
are.
edited, but certainly in trying to pick a couple to excerpt for this coming issue that's at the printer right now for social policy. Whew, they were, you had to
No,
really figure out what
it's kind
what
of a dangerous
what
book.
our readers could handle here.
I mean, there are a few clean pieces. It's not, it's not totally X-rated, but
Well, and by
that was one of
X-rated,
my,
we're talking about, I mean, these are raw experiences that these men are having, and the writing reflects that. I mean,
yeah, I mean
it's true, it's factual.
that's exactly the case. I don't, I mean, I just because this is our fourth collection, mostly out of Parchman, but other facilities where we have classes. And I'm just like, and all the other times I was like editing but this time because of the nature of what was going on in 29 and the fact that I felt like I didn't want to diminish what was going on there in any kind of way, I decided to do as little editing as possible. I mean, there's some, but I also wanted it to be an authentic voice of this particular group of men in this particular unit. And
Yeah,
yeah,
ab
I think it comes through for the most part.
absolutely. Now, of the authors, were you restricted to only those people that weren't on death row or weren't in solitary, or is this a mix of all three?
Toward the end, so when we moved up front to the makeshift classroom and the gymnasium, we did get a mix. So we did get a mix from however many buildings are back there. I think it's 8 different zones. Um, so we got a mix at that point. But prior to that, it was mostly people in these segregated buildings. Um,
Well, give people some sense of some of the pieces that are in the Parchman writings,
oh,
if you could.
I'll read a quick excerpt. I'll try to find a piece that's
I know one of the pieces we included in social policy was a poem. So that I don't know if that's handy, but that was pretty short. But whatever. I mean, you have
I'll tell you what.
characterize them any way you want. We just want to give people a
I'll read
feel
a
for it.
short piece. In fact, it's the last poem, the last piece. That's a poem in the collection by a writer at 29, Leon Johnson. And it's squeaky clean and it's a bit religious, but well, I'll read it and I'll tell you what I like about it. And it's called
Okay.
Not Institutionalized by Leon Johnson. And he writes, I try to live by the mind of Christ and not look toward man. I don't allow anything to bother me. It's all about today, not yesterday, or what tomorrow may bring. I obey these that have authority over me. I do what they ask or tell me do, and I do what I'm supposed to do when there's no one around standing over me. I put no one before anyone else, bond or free. Are there anyone better than you are? I'm really free within. Prison don't have any real chains on me. Now, there's a lot there that could be criticized in terms of this, how shall I say, acceptance of his situation. But at the same time, there is this kind of liberation to this poem that I like. And that here's a man who had never written anything, and he's an older gentleman too. No frame of reference for a literary type of writing or anything of that sort. And I don't think he had ever written just anything at all
Yeah.
until we started working with him. And of course, I showed him some examples of poetry. and what it was about, and explained it a little bit. And this is just one he ended up writing dozens and dozens of poems, and there's more of his work in the collection. But I chose this book to end this collection because number one, as you've seen, as you skimmed over, some of the pieces are just out there and angry and desperate, and and this one I did compromise a little bit. I did end somewhat on a light note, but and sure, it's almost as if he's accepting this, but this man's in for life. What is he going to do?
Right.
So in other words, okay, so let's put it this way. So each of these pieces in 29 is that individual's way of dealing with this incredibly intense and dangerous situation. So each person has their own way of dealing with it, and this was Leon's way. Um, I guess a kind of weird insubordination kind of a thing, but they're still in it. They're still in it a freedom, right? So I mean, if you're incarcerated anywhere, but particularly 29, you're trying to find some avenues of freedom, right? You're trying to come up with some way to deal with this, and I know that you're a political person, and I could speak politically if I wanted to, but as I say, there are certain legal restrictions on me.
We're talking to Louis Bourgeois about the Mississippi Prison Rights Initiative and the new book that he's helped edit and pull together from his nonprofit, which is Unit 29, Writing from Parchman Prison. Now, some of the pieces I read really express sort of an interesting mixture of regret and almost hope. Maybe you had to, dig pretty deep to see that, because a lot of these situations are, as you described earlier, are sentenced without the possibility of parole or on death row or whatever. But there was often real regret expressed, wasn't there?
Sure. I mean, it's all of that. Yeah, regret. I mean, my goodness, we all have regrets. But you have to wake up every morning there. You really have to reflect on things. And yet, hope never dies, I suppose. Not even in the most extreme situations. So yeah, that's a good point. There is, I hadn't really thought about that lately, but there is still hope lingering somewhere within
There was a piece that was referenced in a Mississippi Today article that ran in the New Orleans papers, where one of your authors was talking about something along those lines, sort of wishing for both him and his victim that, at a young age, they'd sort of, the victim was older, he was younger with a couple of buddies or whatever, and just if he could take back those couple of minutes, that was very clear in that piece that was quoted there.
Wilbanks.
Okay.
Matthew Wilbanks in this piece called Scars. Yeah, he's actually from where I am right now, Lafayette County. One of the few. Yeah, I mean, gosh, there's you can write 20 books from the themes that you could uncover by thinking about this book, reading it, and thinking about it.
Some of them, and in fact, one of the pieces I think that is one of the ones we ended up running in social policy. There's less resignation than the poem you read. There's more like fear and loathing, if you will, about what the situation in the prison is and how it's handled. And they're, they may be there for life, but they're afraid for their lives as well.
Yeah, as I say, it's 30 some odd individuals trying to navigate this thing. And that's, I was asked the other day in an interview, I was asked nicely, no one's been mean yet. Well, what about the victims and all this, I'm like, hey, I don't really have an answer for that. I mean, that is a point to be made. When we've had, victims contact us and we talk to them and then and it even offered like, hey, well, let's hear your side. Maybe we can let the world know about that side. But I mean, but my focus is like, regardless of how they got there, this is their real human experience that's happening now. I mean, that's as far as I can take it. And
Look,
yeah.
big headlines recently when President Biden released some 37 people who are on death row
Yeah.
who are federal prisoners.
Right.
And he didn't release them. He took them off of death row and gave them life sentences without the possibility of parole. I mean, there is a robust argument both on the outside and the inside. What's worse? Um, Life in prison without any chance of ever getting out, or, I mean, one of the people he just pardoned or just changed their sentence is actually petitioning to go back to death row because he
Yeah.
doesn't. Um, and this
There
was
are a few. There are a few like who actually want to go through with their own execution. Um, I haven't run across too many people like that, but there are a few. I guess there are good arguments on either side.
But it says something about the value of life. I mean,
There,
for
you know.
even in prison, there are prisoners. These are human beings. They do have some, you can't imprison the mind, so to speak, although solitary confinement does that. And certainly the studies on mental health issues coming from solitary confinement are just terrible to read. There's a big New Yorker piece, maybe you saw a couple of years ago. Regardless, this is a tough row to hoe. And, having people, I guess my real question is who buys these books? What's the impact these books have in Mississippi or any of the communities that you get to talk about this?
Well, our readership is whoever would like to read it, of course. It
Sure.
has had some impact in Mississippi. We've had some politicians take the book to state Congress and read from it to make whatever point they were making about, the whole prison situation in Mississippi. We've had several students actually use their writing when they went before the parole board um, to show the parole board they were doing something constructive and whatnot. The book has been taught in quite a few classes, mostly in Mississippi, but elsewhere as well. We're still a small press, so our distribution is limited to whatever online availability there is.
Sure.
But I did, like I'm not given to false exaggerations, but in each book, it's our fourth book from this program, and each one I think has gotten a little more interesting. And this one I really stand by because I mean, number one, it took us 3 years to put it together, and it wasn't we weren't holding back, so it's kind
No,
of
absolutely. And
a real thing,
it gives you a good picture across the writings of what people are feeling, and it makes you think. The support for your press and for Mississippi, the nonprofit, where does that come from? From the sales of these books or from others that are interested in the situation in prisons or what?
Well, we're self-funded.
Okay.
We do get some grants to do this. The sales of the book it does help allow us to have these workshops. Although of late, I finally figured out how to do this. The writers themselves were now able to compensate to a small degree. For the longest
All
time,
this is a segue as we come to the end for me to ask you, Lewis, how can people get this book?
it's pretty easy.
Yeah.
You get it on Amazon, but if you can get it from us first, it helps us a little bit. It's just voxpress.org, and you'll see it as soon as you go to voxpress.org. You should see this book, Unit 29. It's pretty easy to find. You can order it there. You can order it on Amazon. Or you can email me, Louis, Louis dash bourgeois, bourgeois at hotmail.com. The book is pretty easy to get now.
Vox Press.
VOX, V as in Vernon, O as in Otter, X in Xavier. So VOX.
Absolutely. It means voice in Latin. Always good to move forward. And Louis, good luck with the work you're doing. Anybody who wants to go to the website, I'm sure if there's a donation or whatever you want to make, there's a way to do it. This has been Wage World for another week, the world where the other half lives, where we talk about things you've never heard. And as Lucinda Williams sings, things you've never seen and will never forget. Wage World is underwritten by the Darrow Foundation, a progressive force enabling change based in Little Rock, Arkansas. And as the song goes, we say it loud, we say it on the air, we say it on the radio. Until next week, when we'll have another guest, this is Wade Brathke for Wage World. Thank you.